Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with us here today in IFAD, and those of you who are joining us via webcast, good afternoon. I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all to this high-level session on the role of independent evaluation in transforming the multilateral development banks. This session is being held in the context of the Spring 2017 meeting of the Evaluation Cooperation Group, ECG, of the MDBs. ECG was established in 1996 to contribute to excellence in evaluation by promoting a more harmonized approach to evaluation methodology, encouraging mutual learning and sharing of experiences, and facilitating the conduct of joint evaluations among the MDBs. This high-level session is a unique opportunity to take stock and discuss the future of multilateral development banking in the context of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. I would like to invite Mr. Oscar Garcia, Director of the Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD and current Chair of ECG, to welcome you to this high-level session and deliver his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon. Mr. Gilbert Houngbo, President of IFAD, Honorable Mr. Bang Rodríguez, Minister of National Development Planning of the Republic of Indonesia, distinguished colleagues of multilateral development banks and other development agencies, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me and my team at the Independent Office of Evaluation to extend my warmest welcome to all participants in this high-level session at the spring meeting of the Evaluation Cooperation Group, where we will be discussing some of the challenges that international financial institutions are currently facing and the role of independent evaluation can play in supporting them. Many of you have traveled a long distance to attend this important event, hence our heartfelt thanks for your presence here today. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through difficult times. There are changes in the context that affect the performance of the international financial institutions. I would like to name a few. Firstly, the access to concessional financing that in the past was restricted to a few developing countries with sound fiscal and monetary policies is now more widespread, with the existence of financial alternatives, including access to capital markets. Secondly, the expertise that resides in the organizations to address complex global challenges, such as developing sustainable food systems, warranting access to health and education for all, or the effects of climate change on the livelihoods of the poor, is no longer in the very few hands of our operational departments. And thirdly, the convening capacity of the multilateral development banks on a certain given sector is also challenged by the enhanced connectivity experienced today as a result of information and communication technologies, as well as by increasingly leading role of national governments in developing countries over their own development process. Today's forum gives us all the valuable opportunity to share insights and ideas on how we, as evaluators, can help our organizations to adapt, to change, to transform, as we need to rethink our business models. Let me first talk about the multilateral development banks, the MDBs. We are all aware that the people we serve are nowadays confronted with complex interrelated challenges, which are the consequence of the new global economy and a difficult economic environment. Such challenges call for an innovative and truly transformative approaches to development. To this end, on September 25, 2015, world leaders adopted a set of goals to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all as part of the new Sustainable Development Agenda to be met by 2030, that is, the SDGs. Meeting the SDGs requires new partnerships, new policy agendas, and new sources of financing for sustainable development. We as MDBs have a critical role to play in this transformation process. Our mandates differ. We operate at different levels in different sectors, yet such differences should be seen as an opportunity because they will enable us to adapt complementary roles and strategies. We share a common commitment to eradicate poverty, yet the multiple causes of poverty do require multiple strategies to address them. In this respect, our complementarity offers us a comparative advantage that we need to exploit at its fullest. Mobilizing sufficient financing for realizing the Sustainable Development Agenda is recognized as an urgent need. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda 2015 responds to this financing challenge and provides a powerful statement of global partnership and solidarity. The MDBs are expected to play their advantage of scaling up financing for the Sustainable Development Agenda. Our strength is that we can leverage financing for development purposes, and in these ways, maximize the impact of scarce resources. At the same time, we are also aware of the pressure to mobilize additional sources of funding through new partnerships. At a time when donor funding could be reduced, our clients ask for a wider range of financing mechanisms, and last but not least, there is an increasing demand for infrastructure. Mobilizing financing is not our only strength. Since the early 2000s, all of us have undergone far-reaching reforms and changes in an attempt to become knowledge-based organizations. Our partners strongly appreciate the technical expertise that our organizations can provide. So we need to join forces to address a brighter future. Recent initiatives for mutual collaboration include, for example, bridging the agreement to establish a global infrastructure forum to build and enhance multilateral collaborative mechanisms. Another hopeful initiative was to address the global refugee crisis through the joint statement by the MDBs at the World Humanitarian Summit responding to the forced displacement crisis. There is also the planned initiative to scale up financing for demand-driven climate change. So these are good initiatives that demonstrate our willingness to work together, and we must continue to do so, always aiming at enhanced efficiency and effectiveness in our mutual collaborative efforts. Let me now speak about the role of evaluation. This will be the primary topic for discussion today. What is the role that we, as independent evaluation, can play in supporting our respective organizations in determining future paths towards transformation? The role that evaluation has to play in supporting organizational learning and reform cannot be overstated. Our evaluation approach and rigorous methodology builds on international good evaluation standards and practices, and is based also on the fruitful cooperation among our respective evaluation offices in the context of the ECG. Thus, we are able to provide evidence of what works, what does not work, and most importantly, look at the causes and effects, and sometimes also to the unintended consequences of our initiatives. It's our capacity to ask, to respond to the question why, which provides rigorous evidence on performance and ultimately can contribute to change and transformation. Some examples of recent contributions are the evaluations of social and environmental safeguards, of decentralization experiences, of evaluations of the response to climate change, to name a few. Several of our evaluation offices conducted such evaluations, which have led to changes in institutional process and structures. Evaluation adds meaning and depth to conclusions about global achievements. It provides reality checks. More importantly, evaluation brings the voice of marginalized people to the forefront, ensuring that their demands and interests are part of the agenda. We use field-based methods where we pay particular attention to involving those who tend to be less visible: the poor, women, indigenous peoples, young people. In this conference, we have a privileged audience that can reflect on the challenges and opportunities in front of us. In this endeavor, we will be supported by a high-caliber panel that will guide us in a collective reflection with the aim to identify potential pathways for further action as members of the Evaluation Cooperation Group. Distinguished keynote speakers and panelists will help us keep our focus. First, let me acknowledge the presence of Mr. Enrique Garcia Rodríguez, former Executive President of the Development Bank of Latin America, who will deliver a keynote address on the possible future paths for MDBs. Let me also acknowledge our distinguished panelists, Professor Bangber, Brad Negoro, sorry for the difficulties in spelling your name, Minister for National Development Planning of the Republic of Indonesia. Dr. Joachim von Amsberg, Vice President, Policy and Strategy of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Dr. Cheryl Gray, Director of the Office of Evaluation and Oversight of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Mr. Masood Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development in Washington. Our stellar panel will be chaired by Ms. Caroline Heider, Director General and Senior Vice President of Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank Group. And I want to acknowledge the presence of IFAD's President, Mr. Gilbert Houngbo, who honors us with his presence in opening this conference, since we are really looking forward to his renewed leadership at the realm of IFAD. The collaborative effort and information sharing facilitated by participation in the ECG has promoted not only harmonization of our respective methodologies, but also evaluation independence, professionalism, and learning. In light of this cooperation, today we have a valuable opportunity to reflect on how we, as evaluators, can help our organizations to adapt, to change, to transform. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Oscar. It is now my honor to welcome Mr. Gilbert Houngbo, President of IFAD, to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Distinguished ministers and ambassadors, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to welcome you to IFAD, especially given that we all know that for the more than 20 years, the Evaluation Cooperation Group has promoted a harmonized approach to evaluation. At the same time, through high-level sessions like the one you are organizing now, you create opportunities to share lessons, as Oscar just mentioned, and to examine complex questions related to evaluation. A robust evaluation system comprising both independent and self-evaluation arms. And this system has become essential to the Multilateral Development Bank. Evaluation provides evidence of what kind of results have been achieved on the ground, which is, clearly speaking, the accountability dimension of the function. But at the same time, evaluations also harvest crucial knowledge that can be fed back into the design of new projects. This is the result dimension of your function. These multiple benefits of evaluation cannot be underestimated at a time when partners are increasing their expectation of all development institutions to provide evidence of tangible and sustainable results. Nor are these the only expectations. We are now working in a fast-paced environment in which development agencies must deal with profoundly difficult and interrelated issues, such as famine, climate change, conflict, migration, and so forth. This means that the multilateral development banks must demonstrate agility, innovation, and a capacity to respond to the concern facing the world today. Evaluation is obviously an essential tool in this context, and the independent evaluation offices can evaluate selected topics and provide the basis for effective reform. For example, in IFAD, Independent Office of Evaluation, the office performed an evaluation in 2005. I thought we were going to give that example. And that was about the direct supervision pilot program, which led to a transformation of our business model. Because of that, today, IFAD directly supervises all projects. We now have over 40 country offices around the world and are much closer to our client thanks to this evaluation in 2005. Evaluation is therefore key to delivering more and key to delivering better. To deliver more, however, also requires more resources. Here again, in the area of resource mobilization, evaluation plays an important part by establishing the credibility of the MDBs. Ladies and gentlemen, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals will require a massive scale-up of interventions, particularly in the rural areas where IFAD works, and where most of the poor and hungry reside. Demonstrating impact and value for money are essential for raising the financing that will be needed for that project. By reporting directly to the executive board of institutions, independent evaluation also opens up a dialogue at the highest level between management, the board, and the Office of Evaluation itself. This direct reporting enables MDBs to raise issues and act promptly on their findings. There is also a complementarity between this independent evaluation function and the self-evaluation that management may undertake. The two together can cover a wider range of topics and projects, and thus expand the MDB's capacity for institutional change and reform. Before you begin your discussions, let me leave you with one small thought. As international financial institutions, we need to promote multilateralism if we really mean to achieve the 2030 agenda. The question is why? Because developing countries now make up half of the global economy, and this dramatic shift in the economy landscape will continue to resonate for years to come. But also because challenges like cross-border security, natural resource management, climate change obviously, migration, all of these require a collective global response. Finally, because the ambitious nature of the 2030 agenda demands greater collaboration and coordination, the Evaluation Cooperation Group is well positioned, in my view, to help us meet this challenge ahead. And with this first-rate group of speakers and panelists you have assembled today, I have no doubt you will move us collectively toward the future we all want. I'm delighted that you decided to come to IFAD for this gathering, and I wish you the best in your deliberation. I thank you.
Thank you, President Houngbo, for your words. I would now like to invite Mr. Enrique Garcia Rodríguez, former Executive President of the Development Bank of Latin America, to deliver his keynote address, which will focus on possible futures for the MDBs and the role of independent evaluation in transforming the MDBs.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm very pleased, Mr. President, to be here in your house, and best regards to all the senior staff, the ambassadors, people here gathering in this occasion. I think the fact that this meeting of the group of external evaluation, and that what we are discussing is not only the traditional things that everybody expects from that area, but to tie it up with the things for the future in terms of orientation for how the development banks, multilateral development banks around the world should move ahead, adapt themselves to the changing realities, I think is something to congratulate you. I tell you, well, I have spent most of my career, several decades, quite linked to this world of development banks. I started my career as a young professional in the Inter-American Development Bank, and in 2 occasions I spent 17 years, so I have been all over the bank, in economists, in operations, in project analysis, representative in one country, advisor to the president, and the last position I had was the treasurer of the bank. And then the fact that I was at CAF, as head of CAF, for 25 years, a little bit more. I'm a little embarrassed when they ask me, how did you do that? And I always tell them there is another person who has done much better than I do, and is the former president of the Islamic Development Bank, who has been there 35 years. And in fact, I knew him when I was in the IDB in the early 80s, I think, and they were forming that bank, and I advised him a little bit on how to build up an institution. And to my surprise, I found out that he just left about a few months ago. And also, I normally, when they introduce me and say he has been 25 years and has been reelected 4 times, I immediately make a clarification. I say, yes, indeed, I have been reelected 4 times, unanimous vote, and very important detail, without changing the Constitution. And I say this because now it's quite normal in several parts of the world that president changed the Constitution to remain in power. I didn't change the Constitution, so I'm glad to say. Well, let me make some comments and reflections. I think that as I read in the paper that was presented by you and the group in Washington, I think this is a very important moment to rethink and to adapt the role of multilaterals in the context of what is happening. Let's go back a little bit to history. This invention is a great invention after the Second World War, when Bretton Woods was created, and you had the first one, which was the World Bank. And the World Bank was created, in essence, with the concept of reconstruction of Europe. That was the essence. Even the name of the bank is International Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And it specialized quite a bit in the 50s, and mostly in infrastructure and things of that nature. Then, late in the 50s, you had some newcomers. And at the regional level, and I know that as being part of the region where I belong to, came the Inter-American Development Bank. And the idea came out at the end of the 50s. It was a difficult thing to convince that it was necessary to have an institution of that sort, with the argument that there was the World Bank. And many people don't know that. Even former President Enrique didn't know that, and I told him that making some research, one of the justifications that was given to create the Inter-American Development Bank was that it could lend and act directly with the private sector. At that time, IFC was just it was born precisely 60 years ago in 1957, and that was the argument. And in fact, the first operations that the IDB made in the early 60s were to the private sector. But they got scared because there were some failures, and then everybody thought that the IDB couldn't do that. But what's interesting is that in the early 60s, the contribution of the IDB was a very important one for the development institutions' role, because it started to get involved in areas that were not common before, because there was a lot of emphasis in infrastructure, but the IDB got in water and sewerage and programs in social sectors, in education. Why? Because at that time was the famous Alliance of Progress in Kennedy, President Kennedy in the United States. So the IDB played that role, and it was a very important. Also, in those days, other institutions, and especially in Latin America, of course, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, I don't know exactly when they were founded, but in the case of Latin America, you had several sub-regional institutions created, the Central American Development Bank, CAF, the Caribbean Development Bank, and others. And there was a lot of impetus in terms of the role of these institutions in the world. Now, from what we have seen in my experience in learning the good and bad things of each one of the institutions in which I have been involved with, I think there are some key elements, and perhaps I'll make some comments on what are, in my opinion, some of the critical things that make the difference. And maybe tell you a little bit about the model, the institutional model of CAF Development Bank of Latin America, which is it's different in some senses, well, in many senses, on the traditional multilaterals. It doesn't mean that the traditional multilaterals can adapt themselves to change governance in the way I'm going to tell you, but it's good to know what the governance is and what the challenges were. So to start the story, when I decided to accept to be a candidate for the position in CAF, the reason I accepted is because I knew CAF from another position. When I was in the IDB in charge of all the financial institutions, development institutions in Latin America, and among them, there was CAF. It was a small institution. So I helped at that time organizing it. And I thought the institution had a very interesting future because it has some characteristics that I'm going to mention before. So when I came to CAF, I said three things to the staff the first day. I said, we cannot remain a sub-regional bank with only 5 countries. We have to expand to Latin America, and especially in the case of South America. Then somebody, the manager said, no, Mr. President, it's a good idea, but we have tried. Brazil doesn't care about this because we cannot provide any good service. Second point, it is very important that we get involved in the themes, in topics that have relevance for development. It's very good what we have been doing in the past, especially during the debt crisis, is supporting the countries, that was in the 80s, supporting them with trade financing, things of that nature, because all the windows in the commercial bank systems for Latin America were closed. But that's over. We cannot stay doing exactly the same thing. Let's get an infrastructure. They look at me, no, Mr. President, this is not for an institution of this size. That's for the World Bank. It's for the Inter-American development. Third thing, we have to have access to the capital markets. And for that, we need to get an investment grade rate. Silence, nobody said a word. My spies told me that in the halls they said, oh, this guy is lost. The first thing is very difficult. The second, no. And the third one, he still thinks he's the treasurer of the IDB. Well, it happens that these three elements put together were instrumental in having a change in the institution. And let me briefly tell you what the change has been. In 1990, assets of the institution were $700 million. The level of operations, approvals, basically 80% was on trade finance. It was about $600, $700 million. And as of last year, the assets compared with 700 million, $38 billion. And the level of approvals in operations, $13 billion a year, which makes basically similar level of approvals, a little less than the IDB and more or less the same, or a little more even than the World Bank Group. Well, that was there. Now, what lessons can we get? Why this has happened? And these things, many of the things I'm going to mention, I think can be applied to all the multilaterals. The first thing, I think, there are key elements that I would like to mention. First, key element for success in the multilateral banks is to have a long-term vision and a clear mission. Clear mission. The mission, depending if you want to be more focused, less focused, but it's very crucial that you understand what you are going to do in the institution in the context of a comprehensive approach agenda of development. What do I mean by that? You have to look at the interaction that you have between macroeconomic stability, which is a necessary, although not sufficient condition for development or for growth. Second, microeconomic efficiency, which implies that you have to deal in product transformation, innovation, technology, all these things to create a sound basis for growth. Third pillar, inclusion and social equity. Because if you have high rates of growth, but that there is no trigger down to the poor people, and then you're lost. And in fact, one of the serious issues that the world is facing, and not only Latin America has done very well in many senses, but it's still the region with the worst Gini coefficient. And if you go to rich countries, in middle-income countries, you will have areas of those countries which are in poverty, some poverty. And that's a message, for instance, to IFAD and other institutions. When you make decisions on what to provide to the countries on the basis of per capita income and regional objectives or national objectives in general, sometimes we are misplacing the concept because there are areas in those countries which deserve a very special treatment. Well, so that's the thing. And second thing is, as I said, respond to relevant issues and needs of the clients at a given moment of time. Sometimes it is a lot of infrastructure. Maybe other times you have to be counter-cyclical. That's a very important element. When you give the message for the banks and to say, that's what the countries like, is to say, there comes a banker which brings the umbrella when it's raining, because in sunny days you don't need an umbrella. What does it mean? That you have to have the ability to have products and services in times of crisis, they will respond to that particular situation. Because if, for instance, I recall what happened during the debt crisis. I was at that time at the IDB. The difference with the World Bank and with the IMF was very clear, in the sense that the IMF by its own nature and the World Bank have the so-called structural loans that is more balance of payments, so forth, so you support the country. But the IDB didn't have that. So it was project. So suddenly, in 1983, they didn't have a chance to provide what the countries needed. So it was an occasion to be creative, and the IDB developed a special program that permitted them, within a very tiny exception of the charter, to move into that direction. Second general observation that is client-oriented. Client-oriented is related to what I said before. You have to listen what the client says. The client is the country. It could be a public entity, a private entity. Don't try to come with one rule, with one recipe. try to adapt yourself, your institution, to the differences that do exist among countries. Products and services, there comes, of course, one of the main reasons in the early times of the creation of the multilaterals was the gap between the savings, internal savings capacity, and the requirements of investment, and that gap had to come from external sources, the external savings. Well, that's important, of course, but the lessons that we have is that countries like institutions who not only provide them with cash, with loans, but they bring knowledge. They bring the capacity building process. They bring to them ability to prepare good projects, to have good practices, to look for transparency. That's what you look sometimes. And I go back, for instance, to the issues of middle-income countries, countries that have ratings, that investment grade ratings. They can go to the capital markets, but why do they go to the World Bank? Why do they go to the IDB or to CAF? They will go there insofar as you can provide the value added that implies the capacity of doing things the right way to stimulate development. Fourth element that is crucial is fluid access to capital markets. Of course, in the case of the traditional MDBs, by definition, they have a AAA rating, most of them, because they have the callable capital of the US and Japan and the big countries. Well, but I think that is, as of now, is possible, but there are some revisions in the methodologies that can imply that there might be a change in that sense. But this is a very crucial element. If you go back to the story of my institution, the fact that we were able to get in 1993 an investment grade rating, very low, BBB minus, showing the rating agencies that because of the quality of the financial management, because of the preferred creditor status, the loyalty of the countries to the institution, the institution deserved to have a higher rating than the member countries. Well, and it was proved. And in fact, in these years, it went from BBB minus to AA. Yeah. So this is a very crucial element. And key element, the name of the game is governance. Of course, this implies what's the commitment of the members to the objectives of the institution. And that commitment is translated in what? It's committed in the contribution. It's committed in complying with the procedures. Is the commitment implies that you pay what you own. That's commitment. Now, in the case of the institution that I have presided for the last 25 years, there is a characteristic that is a little different, and it was difficult when we had to take the decision to keep what we at the end did, to keep the institution as different in ownership than the traditional MDBs. In other words, that members, stockholders, will remain only countries, the Latin American, Caribbean countries, with the exception of Spain and Portugal, and that everybody is a borrower and a donor. Nobody is just a donor. That decision was a hard decision because it implied that you had to have a type of management that will provide assurances to the markets that you will be sustainable in the long term. But you might say, but why don't you have, the United States, And the decision was, because the governance is different, we can have excellent relationships, and in fact we did, with the United States, with Japan, with the UK, with Germany, with China, with Russia, everybody, but in a different capacity, not in the governance. You have trust funds, you have agreements, you have co-financing, you have technical cooperation agreements, yes, but no. And why? And this is a very important detail. That was something that those who created CAF in the 60s were very smart. In the charter, is a charter that is very flexible in the sense, first, there is no resident board. If some of you are members of the board of the World Bank, you won't like what I'm going to say, but the difference is that in the non-resident board, which has the European Investment Bank, and now my friends in China and the BRICS also are doing the same thing, the point is that you can have, as members of the board, what is the equivalent to the governors in the World Bank or the IDB. So in the case of my institution, the ministers of finance, of plan, and ministers of central bank presidents representing the countries, they meet 3 or 4 times with a great capacity of decision. A replenishment, increments of capital, can be made, and it has been done in the last 4 years, 3 increments of capital. And in the case of CAF, it's not callable capital, it's paid-in capital, and done in 1 meeting. My last adventure as treasurer of the IDB in the 80s, late 80s, it took us 3 years to get an increment of capital. 3 years. So that's a good thing. And the other thing is delegation of authority, so that the decisions on risk, on project evaluation are concentrated in competent staff. And you might say, but in an institution like that, probably if it's owned by the same borrowers, probably you have a lot of political interference. The answer is no. You know why? Because the voting power is not proportional. It's parity vote. In other words, 1 director, 1 vote. So in my experience, in 25 years, I have never had any pressure on the part of any of the governments for things, you know, they are common sometimes, you know, staff decisions, who is the president, no. It's to try to have a professional management in place. So that's, in my opinion, a very important thing. Now, the question is, could you do that in the traditional MBAs? I don't think so. To go back to a non-board, resident board thing, probably is very difficult. But probably what can be done, and I see in the report that was presented as a very important thing, is that the governance of these institutions has to reflect what is going on today, not what the world was when these institutions were founded. A time when you didn't have the power of China, you didn't have Japan in a different position, you have the different brands. So it has to reflect that, and it translates also in leadership. Who is going to preside these institutions? It should be a competitive, selective process that should try to choose the best qualified person for the position. Other element, intellectual capacity. I think that's a key element. Unfortunately enough, most of the MDAs, all of them, have that power, I think, that you rely on the knowledge, on versatility, on trying the capacity to bring people to the board and to try to help you solve for it. Independence and neutrality in some political issues, I think is a very important thing. You should respect the differences in ideology and the approaches that are taken by member countries. Of course, requiring all the time the quality of the proposals that you are going to consider, but on their own merits. That's a very crucial element. In my region, in these years, you can have all the variety of ideologies in power. You have the right, you have the left, you have this, and you try to respect. You say no when the initiatives are not sustainable, but you don't put additional issues outside the nature of the programs and the projects for the decision-making process. In other words, what we are talking about is 5 C's. You have to have high commitment of the countries, and commitment comes because they see that you are going to be there present all the time. Second, client orientation, second C, that you're responsive to them. Third, creativity, that you are able to implement new initiatives all the time in products and services that are going to be adaptable to the times in which you are living. Consistency, also in the treatment to member countries. And the other C, very important for developing banks, catalytic role. In the past, in the early years of the World Bank, the IDB, the Africa, the important thing is what you did give them. Today, the art of the game is I put $1 and I'm going to get others in the private or public sectors, other institutions, to contribute $4 or $5. Why? Because they know that the presence of the multilateral brings transparency, good quality of projects, good supervision, things of the nature. That's a very, very, very important element that I want to emphasize. And finally, the other C, you have to be conservative in management, financial management, and risk management. I think that we have a very good experiences and very respectful. For instance, IFC has a very good track in taking risks, yes, but doing a very serious matter to keep the ground. So, in sum, I think that there is a time for reinventing ourselves. Normally, if you ask me from my experience, substantial changes in terms of getting to new fields, to new products, and to do new things, you know how you do? You have to rely on external people. Sometimes internal bureaucracies are too conservative. I remember the fights we had when we were trying to get into infrastructure. I got people from outside. For instance, now, the catalytic role, things that are very interesting that many of you are doing probably is, for instance, how you mobilize resources from the capital markets, pension funds, insurance companies in the countries, to try to create a fund in which you put some equity, at the same time you get the government to change some of the regulations for investing of pension funds, and then you have a catalytic role in which you have a multiplier effect in terms of what you can do. So these are some of the things that I wanted to transmit to you, and precisely I think that more cooperation among the multilaterals is a very crucial element. No jealousy. I think that there is ample possibilities of working. Sometimes, for instance, I will notice when you are trying to make some reforms in some of the institutions or create new institutions, so forth, you have the tragic moment and you have a lot of opposition. But I believe that this has to be cured, and I hope that during the discussions and the contribution that the people who are in the external side that can be very objective, very tough in many things, but gain the trust of the staff and the management of the institution by looking at you, not as the people who are like a police, but those who are contributing, learning from errors, from mistakes, to move ahead. So I wish you all the best, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. I'd like to invite our panel discussants to please come and take their seats on the front. Whilst they're taking their seats, I will take this opportunity to present to you our distinguished panelists who will discuss the challenges the MDBs face in terms of financing, expertise and coordination of development efforts, the role of independent evaluation, and possible ways forward to meet today's development challenges. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Caroline Heider, Director General and Senior Vice President of the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank Group, who will be chairing the session. Please join me in also warmly welcoming our panel of distinguished guests. Mr. Bambang Bojonegoro, Minister for National Development Planning of the Republic of Indonesia. Mr. Joachim van Armsberg, Vice President of Policy and Strategy in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Ms. Cheryl Gray, Director of the Office of Evaluation and Oversight of the Inter-American Development Bank. And Mr. Enrique Garcia. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So first of all, I want to thank the previous speakers for setting the stage in such an interesting and inspiring way. And we have put together this panel in order to sort of expand a little bit on the discussion. We bring together a very vast wealth of experience. I invite you to actually look at this brochure that has all of the biographies. If I would start telling you all about the panelists, we would be spending the entire hour meant for discussion just sort of listing all of their achievements. But that means they can draw on an enormous wealth of experience. I've asked them to be actually fairly concise in their responses so that we can cover a lot of ground and have more of a conversation. We want to have 3 rounds of questions. The first round centered more on what are the development challenges that the MDBs face at this moment in time. The second one, sort of using examples of where MDBs have actually learned from the past, so to illustrate a little bit of like how does that work and where does that learning come from. And the last round will be more about independent evaluation and drawing on the panelists' wisdom and for suggestions of what they think independent evaluation could do better and differently. The entire event was triggered by this report here from CGD, and Masoud will be speaking after us and after the question and answers. And it put forward some suggestions and some ideas for what MDBs could be doing differently. Of course, there are other agendas, like the World Bank Group has just approved its what is called the Forward Look, which is suggesting different ways of working with the private sector playing really a central role in the future of the development agenda. Very different scenario from 30 years ago, where the private sector flows were much, much smaller than they are today. Likewise, and we won't be discussing this here on the panel unless any of the members sort of pick me up on that, is I do think we're at a cross point where as we think about sustainability, we have to rethink the way our economic model is working that is basically focused on expanding continuously consumption. There is a limit to that, and economic thinking needs to really get its head around to suggest that. But let me come to the questions, and I'll start with the minister. You are from Indonesia. Indonesia is a powerhouse in the Southeast Asian region, but also globally. You play an important role in the G20. You are one of the key clients, whether it's of the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, IFAD, where we are hosted. When you think about the MDBs, and you've had many different roles and have interacted with MDBs for a long time, what do you see the challenges are, and what would you sort of wish the MDBs do differently in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I think first of all, of course, the role of MDB is to help the member countries, especially the least developed countries or the low-income countries, to be in a better situation or in better condition. And I believe each, especially regional development bank, I think has been trying very hard. And I can tell you, for example, the example of in the ADB, now they have been able to reduce, I think, quite significantly the number of Asian countries living in the low-income situation. So at least from MDB point of view, there has to be clear development target, measurable target in which we can tell or we can evaluate whether their operation has been relatively successful in respective member countries. So that would be the basic for the MDBs. But then to answer what will be the challenge ahead, years ahead, I believe currently we, aside from the climate change, we have one global issue that happened not only in the low-income countries or middle-income countries, it happened also in the high-income countries, and that's about inequality or income disparity. And once this inequality or income disparity becoming bigger or uncontrollable, I believe it will threat even the political stability in every member country. So it means that we are concerned about the sustainability. Of course, inequality is part of the SDG, but I believe now every multilateral development banks need to set their agenda through their financing scheme as well as their programming scheme in order to attack or to fight this inequality. And sharing experience, related to the idea that MDB is not just a lender or development financing institution, but also knowledge institution, as Enrique mentioned, I think now it's the best time for MDB to encourage the sharing experience. There have been some countries that doing well in reducing inequality. There have been some countries doing well in tackling the issues of climate change. So why not MDBs now acting as enhancer, bringing all the best experience and sharing the best experience to everybody. I mean, of course, Regional Development Bank, they can share the ideas or the best practices to their regions, but World Bank, for example, I think they can do more by sharing what will be the best in South America to Asian countries and Asian to Africa, because I believe now with the globalized situation, there has been no kind of localized policy. I think global policy can also be implemented everywhere in the world as long as you know how to modify that policy.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent points about global issues that concern all of us and how the MDBs can really become a facilitator of also a South-South exchange. Let me go to Joachim. You're in the same region, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but you're the newest kid on the block. Not you personally, you've been around for many, many years. But as an institution, you're new. You look at this report that focuses very much on the long-term existing institutions. Was there something in there where you at the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank said, oh, these are good ideas, we should pick them up? Or do you have a very different vision which actually could help the MDBs also think about their own transformation?
Thank you, Caroline. Maybe three thoughts that connect to the CGD report. One, I think we shouldn't talk about the challenges of the MDB system without grounding it in a clear recognition of not only how relevant the MDB basic business model still is, but actually how badly it is needed to deal with some of our big global challenges. I think the biggest contribution of the report is not so much in the recommendation, but in actually retelling the story, not to the people in this room who know the MDB world very well, but to the outside world of what a fantastic business model this is. The basic financial model of the leverage of the MDB, the basic operational model of putting knowledge, finance, and honest broker role together, and the basic governance role of allowing the international community to act jointly in a way that is ultimately driven by technical competence. It's a fantastic model. The story needs to be told again and again because we badly need it. Second thought, the MDB system struggles with, I think, ever-increasing ambitions and essentially flat or reduced resources. Ever-increasing ambitions for two reasons. One, because the world actually needs more investment, there are bigger challenges, there's climate change, there are refugees, there's an increasing set of issues that require MDB investment and action, so there's a legitimate increasing ambition, but also increasing ambition that is more, let's say, politically motivated rather than driven by the actual demands of client countries. I feel the MDB model is overstretching itself, overreaching. It is acting like a mortgage bank that doesn't just ask you whether your house is worth what you're claiming and you're able to repay the loan, but a mortgage bank that tells you how to paint your living room, what furniture to buy, and what spouse you can bring to live in the house. And that's not very attractive to clients. So I think to deal with that sort of disconnect between ambition and resource that have essentially stayed flat or relative to the demands become much smaller, maybe three directions. One is clarify, limit ambitions to what the real client needs are. Secondly, actually increase resources. Yes, I think that's necessary. And that refers to the capital of the system as a whole. And thirdly, implementation of the billion to trillion agenda. That's the whole discussion we've had for years in the MDB system about how to use our capital to leverage much more. And Enrique Garcia has spoken about some of the approaches of how to bring private capital through MDB capital to catalyze as opposed to simply fill financing gaps. So that was my second thought. The third and last thought I want to share, I think there's a need to redefine the interaction between the aid model of development and the development banking model. These are two very different ways of thinking about development finance, and the MDBs, in different degrees, combine these two. So the aid model, in a sense, where there are rich countries and poor countries, and it's all about resource flow from rich to poor and knowledge flow from rich to poor, a very linear thinking of development, and frankly one that is increasingly less relevant in the world in which we live today. And a world in which you have donors on the one side and recipients on the other side, and all the language that goes with that. So the aid world. You have a lot of public resources from donor countries that go to recipient countries. The development banking world is a very different one. It's countries getting together, put up capital, and creating a mechanism that is financially sustainable to leverage that capital, and thereby generate less costly access to capital than they would have had on their own. And I think to different extents, the MDBs have suffered a contamination of the development banking model by the aid model. And I think that has a lot to do, or is a major source for the overambitiousness of the MDBs. And I think that relationship needs to be redefined if the MDBs don't want to be stuck as sort of leftover aid agencies. And this is not to diminish the aid model, it's just to say that I think there's clarity needed about what one is trying to achieve. And I think there the CGD report makes some quite interesting forward-looking suggestions, because the combination of, let's say, grant money for global public goods and self-sustaining development banking finance is going to be an important challenge for the future. I think the CGD report suggests, in a sense, institutional specialization. World Bank does the global public goods, regional development banks do the country business. Interesting, I think I would think about it slightly different. I would think we need two different financial instruments implemented by the same institutions, because I think it's more effective to actually bring the global public goods into national investment programs. When you invest in geothermal energy in Indonesia, you need to tap both resources to make the investment viable, rather than totally different conversations. And therefore, I think more clarity about grant flows that are specifically pursuing global public goods or global agenda, and then finding effective ways of blending them with development banking, self-sustainable financing that is driven by country demand.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I want to actually pick up on this point that you made and you linked to Enrique. And Enrique, in your opening remarks, in your keynote, you already spoke about catalytic role, mobilizing more funds, the billions to trillions agenda, as Joachim was saying. from your perspective, and you're now out of the system after 25 years of leading CAF, when you sort of look at it and say, well, where is the next challenge? Especially you must have lived through many different challenges. Where do you see this type of problem and how it would be addressed by the banks?
Well, thank you. No, I think that this issue of the catalytic role becomes a very important one. Because, you know, it's not only to tap the capital markets, but to try to convince other players, because you have the quality of analysis of good projects or good programs. I think that's a very, very important thing. And secondly, I agree with the point that one has to be careful. This issue of aid institution vis-a-vis bank, I think for a modern development bank, you have to adapt yourself to have the proper windows and activities to go to both. For instance, it would be, in my opinion, a very serious mistake to say the countries that already have a higher rating, let's forget about them. Let's concentrate only on the poor ones. No, that's a very serious mistake, because then you don't have a sustainable institution. You have to differentiate, of course, the type of products and services. You have to find ways to have more grant money for the poor, or for areas in middle-income countries where inequality is a very serious matter, and try to have that balance. I think that's a challenge. And as you said, whoever is in the business of these development banks at the national, international level, you have to rethink all the time, reinvent yourself all the time. And also, a final comment on this, I didn't mention that, but the national development banks and sub-regional development banks, that's a powerhouse in which sometimes in the discussion is not taken into account. We created, together with the president of the KEYNOTE Germany and the agency in France, about 6 years ago, the IDFC, which is an international club of development institutions, and very concentrated on the issues of environment. And it's very interesting. The 23 banks around the world, last year we approved over $100 million. You know? So there is a lot to think. But I agree. I think the comments that were made by both my predecessors, I entirely endorse them.
Excellent. So let me come to Cheryl. Cheryl is the other evaluator on the panel, so we tend to have a little bit of a different perspective. You have done an enormous amount of really crucial evaluations at the Inter-American Development Bank. You've been sharing that experience with us. I know it's going to be hard to put it in a nutshell, but from those evaluations, and you look at this crossroad of where we are, what would you say, you know, in a couple of sentences, what the next stage is, what's the next challenge, and how to get there?
I think as an evaluator, I am inevitably a little more cautious and perhaps skeptical. So I'm going to add a little bit of a different perspective here. And I was really interested in Enrique Garcia's talk, because CAF to me is a fascinating model, and soon the Asian Infrastructure Bank as well, as to what you can create. I worked 25 years at the World Bank with some of the people here, and now 6 years in the IDB. And I think it's certainly in Latin America especially, where we're dealing with really sophisticated clients. I think it's really very hard for MDBs to have a raison d'etre in this environment now. It didn't used to be. You could borrow AAA and lend to countries that had no access to capital markets, and you had a lot of advantages. In Latin America, you've got, as Oscar said in his introduction, counterparts who have ready access to capital markets, frankly, at the same interest rate that we can offer. You have fantastic knowledge and brilliant people on the other side of the table who have great think tanks and can bring in the knowledge. You have, frankly, in the MDBs, in my view, real governance challenges in the MDBs. And we could go into a lot of details on this, but you can see it in my view, and I'll be honest about this, with the Bretton Woods institutions, they are very expensive. They're very expensive models. They're very high cost. And the governance is imperfect, and it's very hard to put a curb on that. The World Bank is enormous. The IDB is enormous. I hate to say it, but my guess it's about 5 times the cost of the CAF for the same amount of lending. About 5 times the cost. I'm not, and they have to pay for this one way or another. And you're not building capital. You're drawing down capital. Right now, in today's world, it's not going to be easy to get new capital. We'll see what happens. But Europe and the US are not particularly in a mood to put in a lot more money. You've got these new competitors coming along that, I'm really curious about the CAF model with the expenses you have. Because on the other hand, we did an evaluation, for example, of middle-income countries in Latin America and asked them, what do you like about what IDB offers? And it was kind of what you said. For one thing, which was surprising to me, they liked the package. They liked the package of good design projects, project management, procurement, safeguards, continuity over political, different political things, the security that comes with the package. That is not necessarily a real cheap package, and I'm curious. We probably won't be able to get into it, but some of those things cost some money. And of course, some people say, oh, it's just a hassle. Safeguards are a hassle. Procurement's a hassle. I'm not sure that's the case, and I'd love to hear from the minister, because I think many ministers of finance really want to be sure that money is well spent, and the procurement that comes with this is actually of value. So there are things that cost money, and yet I see, especially the Bretton Woods institutions, really on the margin of competitiveness right now. And I don't know where we go from here, but I hope they can kind of reform themselves, because otherwise I think some of these new models are going to come along, and in the long run, competition, who knows what's going to happen. So, I guess I'm a little bit less sanguine about the future, unless you can get stronger governance. And we could go into that, at some point. But the governance of the Bretton Woods institutions does not control costs. I'll just put it that way.
So very different perspectives, from the model is still very valid to, well, we do need to do some rethinking here. Let me go into the second round of questions and really focus on exactly those moments where countries or institutions have been at crossroads, and sort of to share sort of an experience of what you learned and what were the triggers and how did that learning happen. And let me start with you again, Minister. I've been to Indonesia the first time something like 30 years ago, and it was a very different country then. When you think back, and maybe if you have a very concrete example where you said, we ran up to this problem and then here were the triggers, this is how we actually learned to change, and what that took.
Yeah, I think we in Indonesia get a lot of benefit by utilizing as much as possible the development support from the MDBs. As you know, Indonesia is a member of World Bank, ADB, Islamic Development Bank, and now AIB plus IFAD. So we are trying to utilize as much as possible, and then each and every institution actually has their trademark in Indonesia. I think World Bank is quite well known in Indonesia for their basic infrastructure that has been built since 1970s. But lately, for example, World Bank is known more for the poverty issue. So I believe one of the MDB role that needs to be increased is as a knowledge institution. We remember that our president invited the country director of the World Bank in Jakarta just to do presentation about evaluation of our poverty alleviation program. And then the World Bank team just basically compare what will be the impact if government continues with their own program, and what will be the impact if the government change the program. So I remember this is between subsidizing the commodity or the goods, or versus direct assistance to the poor household. Mm-hmm. And they basically presented, this is the better result if you do better targeted as what they are suggesting. So after that, it becomes part of policy evaluation, and now it becomes our national policy, meaning that whenever we do the intervention for the poorest household, it has to be through, government direct support to the household rather than subsidizing, staple foods, fuels, or other types of the basic needs of the household. So just to tell you that we got the advantage, we got the benefit, and at the same time, we also appreciate the readiness of these MDBs when it comes to the crisis, because I want to continue what Enrique mentioned in the opening. I think MDB needs to be there when the member country is facing a crisis. So in the case of Indonesia, for example, we had a crisis related to the natural disaster. If you remember the tsunami back in 2004, at that time, I think World Bank, ADB especially, they are, unleashing all what they have in Indonesia and also in the region to support province of Aceh that has been badly affected by the tsunami. But then, I remember even a better crisis anticipation support by the World Bank and ADB, plus we have also bilateral partner Japan and Australia. The moment is, I believe, is mid-2000, either 2012 or 2013, when Governor Bernanke announced that U.S. will no longer continue the quantitative easing. And then suddenly there was kind of mini crisis, especially for emerging economies, including Indonesia, in terms of weakening exchange rate. Of course, the natural thing is to call for IMF support, as a standby support. The facility is there. Unfortunately, the IMF stigma back in 1998 is still there. So as a government, we are thinking not too good if we call IMF right away. So we go the other way. And the other way is to call the World Bank, to call the ADB, to call Japanese government, as well as Australian government, asking them to provide standby loan. The standby loan that can only be used if, let's say, the yield of our government bond, I think exceeding at that time 10%. If exceeding 10%, then we can utilize this standby loan. And the result is very good, because when I did the roadshow for, selling our government bonds, everybody asking, what is your cushion? And I can answer them directly. We have this amount from the World Bank, we have this amount from ADB, we have this amount from Japan, we have this amount from Australia. And the investor is satisfied and our yield is good. So it means that development bank, following what Joachim mentioned, I think has more broader aspect than just aid institution. They can also basically empower the economy of the member country itself. So it's not about helping the poor, but more about empowering and making the economy of the member countries more sustainable.
Yeah, excellent example of the role of the MDBs to be there in the crisis situation and back up the country. But I do want to actually also thank you for the example where there was an evaluation of a program and you learned from those examples, because that's something where quite often, evaluators face the challenge of they're being asked, like, well, who learns anything from your evaluations? And so hearing from an important client like you that, this does happen is great. Enrique, you have been 25 years at CAF, 17 years at the Inter-American Development Bank. There must have been many situations where, the institution had to learn and rethink. Can you give us one very poignant example that sort of illustrates that type of learning?
Yes, of course. Well, through the years, every second you have a crisis here or there. So you have to be ready in these institutions to be upbeat in trying to see. Well, one important thing, for instance, was times when countries were in very serious macroeconomic difficulty. And using the concept of bringing the umbrella when it rains, we never stop supporting. I'll give concrete examples. And even starting before my time, when in Peru, the government of Alan Garcia, not the good, the bad, because Alan, when he was president in the 80s, and at that time I was in the IDB, and Alan decided not to pay anybody. They started with the capital markets, stopped paying the World Bank, and they stopped paying the IDB. So because Garcia, you know, well, maybe they are cousins, the president of the IDB, Enrique Iglesias, sent me to see Alan the Bad, as I call him, and I told him, look, Alan, you can't do that to the IDB. And I convinced him that finally they pay the IDB. But the thing is, never stop paying CAF. Even it was from the risk criteria objective. In those days, of course, CAF didn't have a rating or anything. So, but the portfolio of Peru with CAF at the end of Alan Garcia was, it wouldn't be acceptable today with the rating agency. It was 32%, but never stop paying. So, but you had to be very creative in trying to solve. For instance, today, in the case of Venezuela, it's a very difficult situation. You know how you operate with that. That's one point. The other thing is how to decide to get into the decision of saying we want to bring also as the World Bank, as the IDB, the Germany, UK, United States as members. Of course, if you don't have a rating, a good rating, without that you are dead. So there was a risky decision not to do it. So, you know, every day you have something. When I see my successor, he doesn't know where he has got in. Huh?
Excellent. Let me ask Cheryl, you've done interesting evaluations. Can you give us an example where you've seen the Inter-American Development Bank learn and really transform part of their business or an approach or an instrument?
You know, I'm very positive about the role of independent evaluation in IDB. And I'm not sure that the president would agree with me, but I really feel good about it, and I'm partly facetious because I do think they do. I think this is one of those situations where in the short run, nobody likes to be evaluated, but in the long run, hopefully, they see that there's a value added. And I definitely think that's the case in IDB. It's the right size organization, and our office actually plays a very big role in this organization, partly because everybody, including the board, I think, realizes we have the protection to speak truth to power. And we're set up as a really, truly independent group that has the resources and the access to information and the incentive to just say it like it is. And you know, it's not an easy job, because we have to be very careful to be constructive. You know, you're walking a tightrope. You have to say on things honestly, but you have to do it in a constructive way that people will listen. But I do feel we have a good place in this organization. I mean, the example that jumps out the most is when the last capital increase was done, the 9th capital increase for IDB 9. IDB 9 is called. It was written into the agreement that after 3 years, our office would evaluate whether the IDB was implementing all of the conditions fully and effectively. And it was a lot of conditions. I'll tell you, the shareholders put a lot more conditions on IDB than they did on most of the other MDBs in that round of capital increase. So we came along after 3 years and evaluated, you know, did a very large evaluation, 22 background papers on different topics, and we presented it at the annual meetings, and I think it had a huge influence. And management listened, the governors listened. 3 or 4 major steps were taken, you know, in response, and a lot of small, minor steps. And I think it was very constructive, and I think if you talked to the board and the management, they would also feel it was constructive. I certainly hope that's the case. But all the way along, you know, we're constantly doing evaluations at all levels that I feel get a good hearing and have an impact. You know, it differs from evaluation to evaluation. We basically just try to do the best job we can, to have a very credible quality document, and to do it constructively so that people will listen. And sometimes in the short run, it can create waves. I always say, if there's not a little tension, we're not doing our job.
Thank you. So let me turn to Joachim. This is a new institution. You've just approved the first loans. So far, no evaluations. But still, how do you think about learning, whether from evaluation or otherwise? All of you come from World Bank, Asian Development Bank, so there's a lot of experience at the institution. Are you learning from those experiences and creating a new animal, or just recreating what you know? Sorry for being provocative, but he's a former colleague, so.
Not at all. I think we and my colleagues in AIB management are having so much fun because we are asking ourselves these questions every day, because we have this unique opportunity of creating a new institution based on the learning of decades and decades of the existing MDBs. So we wake up at night, ask ourselves, are we learning the right lessons? There are those lessons of what's working well in the model that we have used as a foundation for our new bank. And in fact, since the idea was of this new AIB was launched, and there was some skepticism by some quarters about China's driving role in that, very firm commitments were made by our shareholders to some of the dimensions where the learning is about what is working well in the system. And that is in particular about the transparency of a multilateral governance mechanism, where we look in some ways quite similar to the existing MDBs, even though with a non-resident board. I think there we have learned from CAF rather than from the other banks. And a very strong commitment to project quality. Sort of putting project quality, high project quality standards, good due diligence, strong social, environmental, and governance policies at the core of the bank is, I think, learning from what is working well, what is an important part of the value added of the MDBs. Now, the learning of where we want to innovate, where we want to be different from our partner institutions. One is focus. I think we have a much clearer, much narrower focus, and we are quite keen to keep it that way. Infrastructure, and that's big enough. That's very big in itself. So infrastructure and project finance. We are a project finance bank. We're not providing the range of advisory services that other institutions provide. We don't do policy lending. We don't administer grant funds. We structure project finance. Very focused mandate and very focused task. Along with that goes, I think, a second distinguishing feature, which is leanness. We aspire to be a very lean organization. Small staff, low cost, nimble, fast, responsive to clients. And that is quite different, as I think some of the comments earlier suggest, from many, not all of the existing MDBs. But we see that as, I think, what clients are most asking for. Respond to our needs quickly. Yes, focus on project quality, but don't add too many whistles, and don't overburden projects, and don't eat us up with your bureaucracy. So that leanness is very important. Now, then come the other lessons. How do you stay focused and lean? One of the factors that I think will help us is our shareholding composition, which in a sense is a bit more like CAFs. We have a very strong overlap between borrowing and non-borrowing, or borrowing borrowers and shareholders. 75% of our capital has to be held by regional members. So that creates a strong alignment between board, shareholders, and borrowers. Then we need to be built on financial strength. We want to be a financially sustainable institution where the borrowers pay our bills. I think that sets the incentives for serving the borrowers. And it avoids some of the pitfalls of the overreach and overambitions that come with fundraising. And that, I think, pretty much unavoidable with fundraising. And I think these elements, leanness, focus, financially strong, and owned by borrowers, interact, and together create a consistent model of a low-cost structure where we focus very clearly, serve the clients, and are financially sustainable. So our president likes to summarize this in the three operating principles: green, clean, and lean. And I think green and clean, we are like the other MDBs. Lean, I think we are quite different from others and hope to stay that way.
Excellent. Very good points. And just sort of to connect that to an earlier question about specialization, and where a number of panelists said, like, it's not about having a difference with the World Bank working globally and the regional banks working regionally, but really specialization in terms of the focus of what you do. I think that speaks very much to the agenda of this institution, IFAD, very, very focused mandate, and I believe also a very lean institution. Joachim, I want to continue with you and ask you about AIB's vision for evaluation. So we're going into the third round of questions, focusing on independent evaluation and what we can do or can do better to help with the sort of transformation of the MDB system. You're starting out, so you can actually also innovate in that space. Any early thoughts?
Well, some early thoughts, but as much an invitation to help us shape the evaluation function in this new institution. So I think one is we have to distinguish kind of along the spectrum of different evaluations. The kinds of deep evaluation that is really about research, long-term learning, impact assessment, long-term understanding results chain. Those kinds of evaluations are really important. We want to draw from them, but we probably won't be in the space of actually doing them ourselves. This relates to our focus. This is a global public good, and rather than replicate those functions, we want to actually connect and network and draw from what's being done in the World Bank and other institutions on the sort of long-term research type learning. And we have big questions. So for example, is the Chinese model of sort of advanced infrastructure investment, is that transferable to other countries? So I have many research questions that relate very specifically to what we're doing. So then on the more, let's say, operational evaluation, I think we're very keen to create a model where evaluation is independent and yet also very close to operations. And I think the two can be reconciled. Independence is absolutely necessary, no questions about that, but it can be much closer in time and interaction than it is in some other institutions. In particular in time. As a project bank, we want very quick feedback rather than learning years after a project is closed. We have a function where the evaluation is in one unit together with integrity and compliance. So we have an opportunity to invent something new here. Very keen to, I think, learn from everyone around the room of how you would set this up. The last aspect where is, I think, less about the structure and more about the culture, which I think for evaluations is actually more important. How can we create sort of a learning culture in the organization? And that depends as much on the evaluators as on the evaluated. If me sitting on the evaluated side don't have the intellectual curiosity to learn what is working, what isn't working, it's very difficult for evaluation to be effective. So I think setting up a system where the institution is curious, the institution is eager to learn, is essential. And we were trying to build that into the corporate culture of AIB. But again, these are just ideas. We need all the help in the world to make this work.
Excellent, great. Reminds me of conversations we had before you left, so I'm very pleased to hear.
I was on the recipient end of Caroline's evaluations from time to time.
So that's great to hear. Minister, you probably know over the last 15 years there has been an enormous increase of interest in client countries, in partner countries, in evaluation, and enormous investments in creating own evaluation capacities. Is that something Indonesia has built, is building up and continuing to expand? What's your vision for that?
Yeah, I think so far we haven't had kind of a formal institution to do the evaluation of the MDB operation in Indonesia. So of course, from time to time, we learn about the independent evaluation that has been produced by each MDB. But at least it gives me a good idea now in my current capacity as Minister of National Development Planning, in which we are kind of like an entry for operation of each MDB in Indonesia. So maybe this is the thing that we need to develop in the near future, in which we do the evaluation of the operation of the MDB. But at least whenever we accept the offer from the MDB, or we are asking the MDB to participate in our development program, we had informally or indirectly this kind of evaluation. So for example, when it comes to, let's say, infrastructure development, we will take a look what World Bank has been doing so far, what ADB has been doing so far, and we know their limitation, and sometimes we trying to negotiate with them how they can better deliver the projects. And maybe one of the result of our constant informal evaluation is that at the end, World Bank and ADB especially have been coming up with a policy development loan instead of just straightforward project financing loan. So when it comes to policy development loan, I think this is a good learning process for both the MDBs and the recipient, in this case the member country, because the policy development loans requires the discipline of the member country to fulfill some threshold in order to get the loan to be dispersed. While from the MDB side, they also learn how to carry out the program, because sometimes if they stick too much on the project loan, they have problem. Sometimes the loan is there, the money is there, but land acquisition is not ready. There is a problem with the local people, so at the end the project cannot be executed. So with this policy development loan, at least from evaluation point of view, then the MDB can do better, because then they can say that we have helped this country to a certain extent, and without failing to execute one or two projects. I believe usually the evaluation is very strict when it comes to the so-called unexecuted or delayed executed projects. So I believe for the future we will set up the system to do the evaluation of each MDB operating in Indonesia.
Excellent to hear, and there are a number of countries actually in the region that can serve as an example with whom you can then collaborate for self-transfer. Enrique, at CAF, you had impact evaluation. I don't know whether you had independent evaluation like Cheryl or my office. Tell us a bit more of like, why was the focus on impact evaluation? How did that get used? And if you would give your successor advice, would you just continue that, or would you start doing something different?
Well, I think that they have done a reasonably good job. Even internationally, they have been recognized. I don't know. They have this special quality mentions, and they got it. I don't think that if I would recommend, I would move to it. It's not an independent, it doesn't report to the board. So I think that I would do that first. The second thing is that I saw the office mixing a little bit what is traditionally what should be the ex post evaluation, to have the results on the life of, if you expected a project to have certain results, that then you can prove after 15 years or so forth whether this has happened or not, and lessons that you can learn for the future. I see they still mix a little bit with issues that are closer related to the area of implementation, which is not the role exactly which should be done. But in general, it's okay. From the standpoint of my office, I was pleased with them, but perhaps they should be a little bit more client-oriented, as you said. It's a tough job when you are going to judge things. Nobody likes that, but how to show that you are doing this and that you are going to help the institution and even the officers to improve the quality of their work in the analysis and evaluation of projects.
Mm-hmm. And so let me close with Cheryl, and you've completed 5 years at Inter-American Development Bank. I know you've introduced many, many changes. Looking forward, is there something where you say like, well, these are the next things which we're going to introduce, or something that sort of corresponds to like how does evaluation transform itself to help MDBs transform them?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's going to be consolidation in a sense. I'm leaving the end of March next year. It's the end of my mandate, and part of being independent is you have a mandate, it ends, you can never work for the organization in any capacity again, even as a consultant, which I think is exactly right. So my successor can take over and to carry it forward. I think one thing I would stress is, and this is where I think the World Bank really is quite impressive, I must say, and many of you are there. The basic architecture, I always stress the architecture of evaluation as being important, the architecture of monitoring and evaluation. And the way they built it over, 25 years or 30 years at the World Bank is, the project team lays out what they expect to achieve. And, kind of a simple results framework and indicators along the way. And it's their responsibility to lay it out. And actually, IDB has some stronger rules in the World Bank even on upfront what this should look like. Then their responsibility to monitor it on a regular basis and to do their own self-assessment. And then the Independent Evaluation Office comes along and validates that. And if you go to the World Bank, the last 30 years, every single project, you can find an independently validated, honest view. I was in operations for a long time before I went to evaluation, and I can tell you as an operational manager, you never get punished for failure. You get punished for overstating success. I mean, obviously they want you to succeed, but if you have a project that's not doing well and you report that it's a success, and then IG comes along and says it's a failure, and that happens repeatedly, they start asking you as a manager, what are you doing? And in fact, if you have too much success, they come along and, senior management, are you sure about this? And I thought that was a very healthy incentive, and it's something, Joaquin, for your bank. I mean, to allow failure and to not punish and to say this is part of being a development bank is really important. IDB, is trying, but it's hard. The culture is hard to admit failure, and I think this is something that's very, very important. And our little office doing that validation is I say the tail that wags the dog. It's what keeps the whole system honest, because before we started it in IDB, they reported 100% success, literally. And we have that on record. Whether there was no evidence, or there was a lot of evidence, it was always 100% success because nobody ever checked it, and why not? But once you start checking this, and it's not real costly to do, the whole system kind of falls into place as long as you allow failure, and as long as it's honest reporting of failure. I think it's kind of ingenious, and it's not super expensive. And to me, that kind of basic monitoring and evaluation is the most important thing, far more than fancy impact evaluation. To know what's going on, to follow it, to correct mistakes as you go along, and to have some kind of simple record. That's not real expensive to do, but to me it's very important. And I can tell you, IDB's had a real hard time getting there. I mean, it's slowly but surely moving, but it's had a hard time getting there. It's something you don't take for granted when you see how hard it is for many organizations. So if anything, I would just recommend that basic architecture. With the evaluation office being the final step, because it's important to keep the system honest.
Okay, excellent. This has brought us to the end of the panel conversation. We have now a coffee break. I want to shorten that to 15 minutes instead of half an hour. Have everybody back here in the room as 4:45, and then we will have question and answers, because I'm sure all of you have been listening carefully and have a lot of questions. So we'll then take question and answers before we go to the closing session. So please enjoy the coffee, and looking forward to seeing you back in the room in 15 minutes.
Good.
Let's welcome everybody back to a continuation of this session on the challenges of the MDBs and how they need to transform and what the role is of independent evaluation in that process. We had, before the coffee break, a very interesting panel discussion, and we wanted to now follow up with some question and answers. But before we open up for Q&A, let me really try to synthesize the very rich sort of contributions. It's a tough thing to do because everybody had so much interesting things to say, but our discussion really ranged from some feeling that the MDB model still valid, still functioning, to no, there is a real need to rethink that model, that there are challenges about the governance structure, the way the institutions innovate and develop new instruments. And I would add also the partnering with the private sector that we actually didn't touch upon too much in the discussion, which has become really a central feature to the development agenda. But I do want to quote the president of IFAD, who said that multilateralism is very much needed. So it's not a question of doing away with the multilateral institutions or the MDBs. It is very much needed to achieve the SDGs. It is needed for global progress on many fronts. Then I wanted to refer to the ministers pointing towards two global challenges that all countries face equally: climate change and inequality. And I think that should function as a unifier, even though these are, negative things, but maybe unifying us around an agenda that we are all challenged on, and where the multilateral development banks, as well as the UN agencies and other actors in the development arena, need to come together and play their respective roles. We have spoken about a number of things in terms of the package of services, as Cheryl called it, or the catalytic role, as Enrique referred to it. And that is whether it's moving from billions to trillions, whether it is moving from knowledge to action, or including partnerships. And it is in this area where really also the innovation, the reform, the changes may have to come from, whether it's renewing instruments, whether it is ensuring the combination, the package, as Cheryl said, comes together rather than having standalone individual projects pursuing agendas that might not actually link up and help the client countries achieve what they want to achieve. And then finally taking knowledge, taking research, all the way to evaluation and making that useful to client countries and the global conversation to deliver more and to deliver better, as the president said in his introductory remarks. So with that type of platform, let's open it up. We have microphones that are roaming around. Please do introduce yourself. We will take about 3 questions first, then go back to the panel, and then take another round of questions. So we have up front here.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Welcome back to IFAD, your house of initiation in MDBs. We are happy that we had such a good panel. We are also happy that we got brilliant ideas and also good examples. As an African, I would have loved also to have some African experience in the panel, but unfortunately, probably, I don't know what happened, but it might come next. So we've heard a lot. I'm not sure that what I'm going to say could be really challenging, but there are 3 things that I want to name here, and I wish some of the panelists could tell us what among those three things could be the main challenge in today's IFIs and MDBs? Is it the global governance of the financial world? And I want to relate it to what is happening in many countries, not only in developing countries, including developed countries. I don't want to name the most recent one. The issues of structural adjustment. It is always a problem when they come to a country and start negotiating the structural adjustment programs. It is never, people are never friends after that. And it goes on and on for years. You continue to feel the pinch of structural adjustment program. I am also one of the elements because our structural adjustment program started in the early 90s. And I might not name all the problem that we've had since then, but you named them. Is that global governance of financial institutions? The second is, do we have a good balance of regional distribution of MDBs? And do they respond to the need, as Enrique said, of the clients? Because when you say a development bank, development is so huge, so that is it lack of specialization? And I'm happy that some are working already in the area of infrastructure, so that they narrow their scope. But still, when you talk of development bank, development is so big. And mind you, there is a big issue there, this dilemma of what should we finance? Because it's easy to put money in infrastructure than to develop, agriculture. It's very easy. What you can put in 1 year in infrastructure, you take 10 years to put it in agricultural development. It's known by everybody. So what is the problem there? Is it lack of resources? Or whatever. So these are three elements in the challenge. Now coming to the evaluation. What could be the contribution of evaluation in that? Is it today? I know that evaluation processes and the ECG is trying to transform it and so on, but the challenges still remain. The world is changing almost every day. So what was true yesterday cannot be true today. And it is always posing a challenge to evaluations on evaluating something that was true yesterday and what was put in place and is being evaluated today with the challenges, the new challenges. So how can the evaluation process contribute to all this? I'm sorry to have been long. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Who would like to go next? Over here, please.
Thank you very much. This is Syed Hussain from the Islamic Development Bank. This really is the icing on the excellent week organized by IFAD, so I really appreciate everybody over here. But this is too good an opportunity to miss and not to put some difficult questions if possible. Particularly for Professor Bambang. People in your position interact with MDBs and bilaterals on a regular basis. You have access to finance. The infrastructure requirements of your countries is very, very high. MDBs find themselves struggling and squeezing in their positions. But MDBs are also growing old. If not 70s, they're in their 50s. Have they kept pace in their staffing and skills and capacities with the changing financial product paradigms? You have mezzanine financing, you have first loss capital financing, you have complex Islamic financing products like Istisna or Service Ijara. To what extent do people in the MDBs are able to grasp, understand, and then relay and explain all these financial innovations that are happening? Are they leading at the forefront or not? And my second questions are to the two esteemed evaluators here. There are a number of people who critique the function of evaluation in itself. They might argue that accountability is well and good, but it's never a popular game. But on the learning side, paradoxically, some people would say that we are getting too obsessed in trying to determine causality in an area of development which is not an exact science, which can be studied through RCTs and observance and all that stuff. This is a very complex process where so many factors are taking place. And maybe other new kids on the block, as you put it, they are very practical in their approach by saying, you know, we're not going to be waiting too many years for a post-evaluation of a project in Malawi to determine whether it is applicable for a project in Sri Lanka. The question is that, are we getting obsessive in our quest to determine and find the car keys where the lamppost is and not where we lost them? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And do we have any, Marvin here in the front, please?
I'm Marvin Taylor Durmont from Asian Development Bank. Multilateralism is alive, as you said, Caroline, and the president of IFAD said. However, I think that what I hear from all the panelists that there's much of an agreement with what the report of the Center for Global Development says, that MDBs have to change and adapt. So here you have all the heads of the evaluation of multilaterals. They're all here. It's a special audience here, with everyone with the exception of Cheryl. What would be 2 or 3 things that you would like us to take on board that we should do to accelerate that change process in MDBs?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's do first a round of answers. The first questions were around the main challenges for IFIs. It wasn't directed to anybody in particular. Evaluation, changing world. How do we evaluate the past and make it relevant for the future? Very specific question to you, Minister. And then some questions about the evaluation and whether we are dinosaurs, to put it mildly. Let me start maybe with Joachim.
Thank you, and just a couple of thoughts. One, global governance. I think one of the reasons for the creation of the institution that I'm working for is that governance arrangements are very difficult to adjust over time. And I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons that led to the creation of AIB was the difficulty of changing voice in existing multilateral organizations. And it was not by accident that when the IMF quota reform was stuck for the 3rd time in the US Congress, that was the time when China decided to move forward. So a new organization provides the opportunity for a different composition of shareholders' governance. What I want to emphasize, though, is that, in my view, China taking the lead to create a new multilateral institution based on the fundamentally same business model, but then with some significant modifications and learnings, is actually a strong tribute to the system and actually helps make the system more robust. I think that you have now credible multilateral institutions that can be led by different configuration of countries. And I think it's a very healthy situation that shows that there is a robust underlying model that does not depend on the leadership by one particular country. And I think it's very timely to, remind us of that robustness. So that's one thought I wanted to share. Which also, on the basis that I actually don't disagree with Cheryl on her skepticism or on her challenges to the multilateral system. I think it's quite consistent to think the basic model of how multilaterals work is badly needed today. The report says if they didn't exist, they would have to be invented, and yet have fundamental challenges that we need to adjust to. I think that's very compatible. Second comment, I think triggered by your comment on Africa. We actually are allowed to invest beyond Asia, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In fact, we have now quite a few African countries join us as members with the expectation that we'll invest there. However, as a young organization with very small staff, it's an illustration of how we want to build the organization differently. And we don't want to now hire staff who can work in Africa. We will work with and through partners. So if we are asked to invest in Africa, we'll not do it with our own staff. We'll co-finance or work with partners who are present and who have the knowledge to work and invest in Africa. And that's, I think, the model by which we can stay lean. The same applies to the sort of learning evaluation function. I already said we don't want to build that, but we will need to draw from what other institutions are doing. We want to know whether what we're doing is ultimately providing results and impact. It's just that we don't think we need to create another body to do more research on that. We just want to be well networked to those who already work on that and strengthen that system. I think that's the way we want to configure ourselves differently. Marvin's invitation, we don't need to change, but we want to desperately learn all the lessons. So I think my plea to you as evaluators would be always keep in the back of the mind the learning for the system, not just the learning for the one partner or the one project or the one institution you're working for. But we are very keen to learn from the evaluators of the other institutions because we can build our institution on that. And it's sort of also a reflection of the CGD's emphasis on looking at the whole system and shaping the system to be more effective.
Great.
Okay. Let me start by, making the definition about the success of the MDB operation in member country. I think the success should be measured by how to make the MDB still relevant to the member countries despite different status of the country itself, from low-income country, maybe graduating to middle income and later to become a high-income country. So although they have been successful, for example, making the countries out from the low-income countries, they have to repositioning their strategy, their program, as well as their financing when the country already in the middle income status, or let's say we call it emerging situation. And then when they become a high income country, of course, somebody will say, I think there's a time that we don't need to help them anymore. But don't forget that even you are in the high income country, it doesn't mean that everything has been settled down, everything has been perfect in that country. There are a lot of development aspects that those high income countries still need the assistance and support from the MDB, and to some extent through their financing program. And to be more relevant, or to be still relevant to the countries, of course, the MDB has to be quite general, but to some extent specialized, meaning in the case of the World Bank, for example, in Indonesia, of course, in the beginning, they're focusing on infrastructure, basic infrastructure, education, health. But then they realize it's no longer a bigger issue in Indonesia. At least our budget already covered the issue of education, health. So what will be the issues that World Bank can contribute to Indonesia? Now they come up with the idea to support tourist development. So tourist sector development, tourism development in Indonesia now being supported by the World Bank. The question is it still a development issue? Yes, because to build integrated tourist resort, you need good infrastructure, you need to educate the people to be part of the tourism industry, and also many other things. So they are trying to be different. And similar with the Islamic Development Bank, because Islamic Development Bank, in the beginning, they are focusing so much on the education, higher education especially. But now, because our needs is more for infrastructure, although a little bit slow, but at the end, now IDB has put more efforts and more resources into infrastructure, and similar with the ADB. And I have to say that the specialized development financing institution like AIB it's not just beneficial for the member countries, but also it's good for solving the global issues. So in the case of the IB, for example, now we know that everywhere in the world, we still need to build infrastructures, but simply fiscal capacity or government budget is not enough. So we need private sector participation. Of course, this has been addressed by other MDBs, but I know the AIB is a little bit ahead. They are more progressive in trying to get private sector involved in building infrastructure. So they could allow, maybe sometimes in the future, kind of joint financing between so-called the public financing through the AIB, from the member countries' capital, plus the private sector. And they could also support like public-private partnership. So I think this is good for everybody. It's not just for the member country, but it's good that now we have institutions that can support or can give more participation for the private sector. And then last but not least, I would like to touch on the issue of structural adjustment that raised at the beginning. I think it's clear. The MDB, I think the success of MDB has to be based on the ability to improve the economic condition of the member countries. And there is no other way, in our experience, in any development literature, that if you want to graduate from low-income country, becoming middle-income country, and later high-income country, you need to do structural adjustment in many ways. And I think this is the challenge for MDBs at the beginning, how you are going to do the development financing support, and at the same time, encouraging the recipient countries to do structural adjustment. In our experience in Indonesia, I think both World Bank and ADB have been very influential in pushing the government of Indonesia to do structural adjustment. This is ranging from anti-corruption, good governance, up to transforming from the natural resource-based economy into more process-based economy. So again, this is not just lending operation, this is not just about the financing, but this is also about changing the development landscape of the member countries. And for Marvin, and since I was in the session that you chair in ADB annual meeting, I think one input for MDBs, in this case Asian Development Bank, is how can ADB also give different focus to the emerging member countries. Of course, one of the ADB success is Korea. Korea, from low-income country, one of the poorest country in Asia in 1950s, now become one of the developed country. But then you cannot repeat the story of Korea from time to time, because many people will ask you, what will be the next? So I think ADB now needs to have maybe different formula, how to now to promote the emerging middle income countries in Asia to be in the higher income level, or to be in the becoming advanced economy like Korea. I mean, maybe in the simplest language, I would urge you to tell ADB, why don't we create the next Korea? Because I think that will be beneficial for everybody, and it becomes motivation, even for member countries, to be in the same level like the high-income country or advanced country.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Enrique, can I ask you actually to talk a little bit about the balance of the regional distribution of MDBs? Because, I mean, you are working mostly on Latin America, but if you look around the world, do you think there are other institutions that are dealing with the challenges of the other regions, or is there a need for some redistribution in that sense?
No, I think the issues, different degrees of complication, but in essence, there's a time to reinvent ourselves in general. to adapt to these new times. You know, when these institutions were originally created, we didn't even have telex. You know, and so you have to think about that. So I think the big challenge for all of them is to create the type of products and services in different sectors, in different areas that are the appropriate ones for the times that we are living, and how to make the institutions attractive. I think there is sufficient room for many institutions. It's wrong to think that there are too many. I think there's room. The point is, what type of additionality can they provide? How can they work together? And I think there's a lot of room. And from my experience, for instance, I'll use the example with the CAF with IFC, for instance. We have worked very well in creating things because there is mutual understanding. There's no competition. That's one of the issues that I see sometimes, that institutions are very jealous. And the loan officers or the operation officers are judged for their, you know, for the personal evaluation of the year on quantitative matters. How much do they approve? You shouldn't do that. You should have criteria that show that the more you can get others to participate, the better you are. You know, so it's something that I believe in. And the other thing that I insist that don't try to just keep saying we are going to concentrate only on the very poor countries and forget about the other ones. Well, you can do that, but then you become a fund that depends on replenishment of capital in a time when it's difficult. If you have attractive products for mid-income countries that are not only financial, are, you know, the knowledge base, institutional matters, that gives you a dimension and sustainability in the long run, where you can be profitable, you can have extra resources, you can have money from profits to grant technical cooperation, things like that. So it's a perfect time to discuss the matters. And I see, for instance, I was looking at the IFAD, for instance. IFAD has a great possibilities in the future, in my opinion. But it has to be open to have the variety of products and services and not come to the conclusion that you are a fund or you are this. No, let's talk about the concept of the development institution. That is, in essence, if they lend money, they are a financial institution, like it or not, with principles of development. That's the main thing. With very conscious about the issues, the crucial issues of poverty and inequality. And you have to tie it up. If you want to solve or help solving the issues of poverty and inequality, you can't do that in an isolated way. You have to work in a model of productive transformation so that you are going to ensure a quality of growth that is the necessary one. And it's based on how you educate people for the 21st century. We are too many lawyers, too many economists, but what you need is abilities to insert yourself, and in the rural area especially, you have to get that. So it's a great time to think.
Good, excellent. Cheryl, there were two questions for us evaluators. The first one was about the world is changing. How can evaluation that looks to the past be making those lessons relevant for the future? And the second one was whether we're too obsessed with causality, whether we need to rethink this whole ex post evaluation and think more about complexity.
On the first one, actually a lot of our evaluations are quite just in time. So it's not necessary, that they be really out of date, I think. We go and look at country programs and how they're proceeding, and it's really very up to date before they do a new strategy, for example. So I think it depends on how you do evaluation, but there's a lot of things you can do that is not, really of things that were way in the past. So I think that is a good point. And by the way, I want to say, Joaquim, I think your strategy is exactly right. And back to your question, I do think we've kind of obsessed, parts of the field have obsessed on very technical attribution, impact evaluation with very, very expensive methods. IDB is one of them, and I might advertise we're doing an evaluation now of IDB's entire program of impact evaluations, of which there are something like 600 that they've paid for over the last decade. And that will come out in a few months, and I suspect it will make a few waves because it's just a huge expense. And we'll see what we come up with. But I think we've had this really interesting conference the last 2 days on IT, and it's so clear that there's so many ways you can tap into the networks to get the information, academic information, where the academic community is definitely very motivated to do very technical work, and there's all these systematic reviews that's pulling it together, and it's a whole world out there, and there's absolutely no reason a bank that wants to say lean needs to internalize that. I think you can draw on that, so I think you're smart on that. So I would say, at least for the MDBs, that may not be the real comparative advantage. You could argue about that, but I think we have tended to go overboard there. I'm very into the simple monitoring and trying to evaluate what we're doing, not so much a lot of academic work, but our projects and following them and making correcting mistakes as we go along. I think that kind of thing is really critical. Let me say one other thing, two other things. Marvin, to your point, and I think generally we were saying, yes, there's clearly a role, we all agree, for multilateralism. No question, you need it. If you didn't have it, you'd have to create it. With regard to the CGD, I read that, and we could have an interesting debate. The problem is these institutions don't collaborate. They don't collaborate. The MDBs compete with each other. There's very little collaboration in my experience. Because it's human, and people want their organization to expand. And it's kind of striking. And this idea that you can specialize, and the World Bank will be a big global public goods bank, and the regional banks will be the direct ones. It's nice in theory. I'm not convinced in the reality of our world that this is going to work. I'm kind of shocked how hard it is for organizations to actually collaborate because of the incentives within the organization. It's an interesting phenomenon. I do think governance is the issue. Back to your original question, is the biggest issue, and getting good governance. And that doesn't mean the U.S. versus China. It's really much more at the micro scale. What are the incentives within an organization to be efficient and to deliver the goods? I'm very impressed, as I said, with the CAF model, because as we were talking during the break, there's not many checks and balances in this model. You don't have independent evaluation. You don't have a board, for better or worse. Maybe for better. It's certainly more efficient. And I honestly think this gentleman has been an amazing leader, because if you had a bad leader, there's a lot of space to do a bad job. If you have a good leader, there's a lot of space to do a good job. Leadership really has a lot to say here. It's a little bit risky, but I think our model is much more of checks and balances and accountability. A lot of what we do on evaluation is about accountability and bringing checks and balances into an organization. This is taxpayer money. You need to have some accountability for how it's spent. And the CAF model is very lean, but somewhat risky. With good leadership, it can do very well. With bad leadership, it can fail very hard. So there's some interesting balances there. I just thought I'd make that point.
Great. Let's take another round of questions. I have Paolo, and then Per Basto, and then Jan Willem. And did you want to ask a question as well? No? Okay. And Auguste. So we'll take 4 questions. Paolo first.
Thank you. Let me stand up as behind. Thank you very much for the inspiring discussion. As we are at IFAD, I wanted to take this opportunity to follow up on one of Enrique Garcia's interventions on what he recommends or how he sees IFAD's future in a way. I'd like to take to this opportunity to tap into each one of you's insights and according to what you know of IFAD from the field and as a global player, probably one of the largest UN agencies and one of the smallest financial institutions with this very specialized role in rural poverty reduction. What would you do if you were making decisions for IFAD's future in 5 or 10 years' time? How do you see IFAD's evolution? And with regards to evaluation, how can evaluation assist in this strategic orientation without losing any of its independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Per?
Yeah, I'm Per Basto from Norway, but representing the OECD DAC evaluation network. From a donor perspective, we often see establishing of new multilateral organizations. I mean, we have seen it in the climate with the Global Green Fund, and increasingly new multilateral organizations are being established. My question, I'm wondering, is it possible to transform an existing multilateral organization? Or is the answer always to create a new one to get it clean, lean, and green? So I guess my question is primarily to you, Joachim. Is it possible to transform the existing MDBs? And do you have any examples if the answer is yes?
Okay, great. Jan Willem here in the front row. In the front here in the middle, next to Marvin.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. Well, I also have a question to Joachim, so he will be busy until the end. Not only because, well, I'm Jan Willem van der Kaaij from the European Investment Bank, and it's not only because our institutions have much in common, but more importantly because you are in a unique position now that you are, let's say, present at the creation of a new institution. You said in your first intervention, I very much agree with that, that MDBs in general should, say, limit their ambitions. If you take it into consideration that those ambitions are not always, let's call it, homegrown, but are also being pushed them by their shareholders, and you're now in a situation that you are creating a new institution and can learn from the lessons of others, how would you think that you could help to limit the ambitions of your institution? Thank you.
And Auguste is the final.
Okay, thank you. I'm Auguste Kwame from IEG World Bank. My question is really for Minister Bambang. We've talked a lot about evaluation on the supply side. We know we can do all sorts of evaluations. We haven't talked much about the use of evaluation. And I'm asking the question to you from the client perspective, because internally we talk a lot about, our evaluations are not being used by our institutions, and we have some thought about how to work internally to make that happen. But from the client perspective, what do you do to make sure that we actually learn when our institutions go to you to provide you with a loan or a project? You started by talking about knowledge sharing regionally and globally, but how do you as a client make sure that this knowledge is coming through our evaluations? How do we use evaluations to transform our institutions, as the title of the session says? Do you ask tough questions? When we do a new project in tourism, for example, in Indonesia, do you ask the World Bank, what lessons are you deriving from previous evaluations of your project in other regions or other countries? Or do you even ask whether we have learned from ADB or from other development institutions, because we don't collaborate? Maybe you can make us collaborate. Maybe you can ask us to, bring to you the knowledge that we can gather from others' evaluations, not just our own evaluations.
Great questions. Thank you very much. So let me actually turn right away to Minister Bambang, if you want to take that question, but also, of course, the other ones.
Yeah. Let me respond first, the first question about the role of IFAD in the future. I think given the fact that we have in my opinion, two main issues globally, climate change and inequality, I think IFAD will certainly be in the very strategic position, because for climate change, I know that most of IFAD projects always have some kind of environmental instrument as a part of the program or part of the project, meaning that attention to the environment will always be on the on the IFAD project, and that will be helpful. But on the second issue, on the inequality, I believe IFAD will even have a greater role, because when we are talking about inequality, part of inequality, especially in the low and middle income countries, are coming from the poverty. As long as you haven't solved the poverty issues, then you will be prone to have relatively higher inequality. And when we are talking about combating the absolute poverty and inequality in low and middle income country, the most marginalized group would be farmers and fishermen. And clearly, all the IFAD project targeted to these groups. And one thing that I really appreciate about IFAD project, at least what I know in Indonesia, is the emphasis is more on the empowerment of the farmers and fishermen, more than the emphasis on, let's say, building the infrastructure. So the most important thing, how to make sure these farmers and fishermen, after intervention through a program or project, will be sustainable in the future, especially from income point of view. And I think IFAD, with the experience and then, of course, close collaboration with the other Rome-based agency, I think will be in the very important position. And a little bit about collaborating among the agencies. I think the collaboration can start from the financing. Lately, at least in our case in Indonesia, there have been several efforts to do co-financing for same project or same program, meaning that indirectly there have been some kind of collaboration among these MDBs on certain issues with the same projects, but then they share the financing. And we noted, for example, IFAD and ADB working on the project of irrigation in Indonesia, and also AIB and World Bank working on the slum, alleviating urban slum in Indonesia. So I think this is a good start, to ensure collaboration, because once you have similar interests, which is the success of the program that will be financed by each of the organization, then basically you will be forced to collaborate, and you will be doing, or you will try to synchronize. For example, IFAD has its own program for agriculture, maybe ADB has its own idea, but at the end, ADB will realize that IFAD has more expertise in the area, and ADB basically supports, and then, of course, disburse the financing. So I think this could be a very good start for the collaboration. And then to respond from the World Bank evaluation group, I think, of course, to be honest, I didn't ask Rodrigo, the country director of Indonesia, when World Bank somehow come up with the idea to finance the development of tourism in Indonesia. First of all, we thought that this is a good idea, because we never think that tourism will be one of the very important sector in Indonesia. At least World Bank trying to be relevant in this area, not just on the manufacturing or agriculture, but they also looking for the tourism. And then when we discuss about this tourism project, basically about the infrastructure. So it's not too much about the tourism itself, but more on the infrastructure to support the tourism development. So in our opinion, this is like other World Bank project in the past, although now we as a government trying to direct this infrastructure project into certain areas in Indonesia that have tourism potential. So I think evaluation, to be honest, we never really look into the evaluation report from the World Bank or ADB or from others, but of course we do our own evaluation on their previous projects. And we usually use our evaluation to propose some new ideas. For example, now with the World Bank, we do more on the policy development loan rather than project loans. And then ADB now comes up with the idea of result-based loan. So I think once the project is completed, then the money will start to be disbursed. So I think this kind of innovation is derived from what has happened in the past, because if you just doing traditional project loan for countries like Indonesia that still has problem at the local government on the land acquisition, then there is a risk the project could fail, and once the project fail, it's a cost for both, for the lender as well as for the country. So I think we better do things that will make sure that the country will get the financing, but the project is there because the project still needs to be built as a proof that we can, withdraw the money from the lender. I think that will be my observation so far. Yeah.
Thank you. Enrique, the question, IFAD's future, and Pierre's question about can MDBs transform, or do we always have to create a new one?
Well, let's start with the second one. All depends on the political willingness of members to really undertake substantial adaptation and changes. And if you have that, in my opinion, it's better to just upgrade and make the changes. Perhaps a good example is precisely CAF, because if you look at what it was originally, it was well conceived, but it was a small institution that was related to the Andean group industrialization process. All depended at the beginning of decisions that were taken outside CAF. Then it went to trade, but the decision to move into what it has been done was a political decision. And the political decision comes not only with the fact that I support it, it brings with it cash, because it's the willingness to make increments of capital to respect all the rules of the game. So I think all depends. And there are experiences, I don't know in the case of Asia, but in Latin America, there have been the last 15 years or 20 years, several institutions that were created in the atmosphere and enthusiasm of the speeches. And they're still there in the very, one, I can be quite frank, Banco del Sur, the South Bank. Well, it's there, it has a name, but it does not exist. So it all depends, but I prefer to move step by step, to have a clear mission, and you want to transform, but you have to have a program for that. You have to show that, and you have to have leadership, and you have to have the qualified staff that will be able to make the transformation. And on IFAD, your question?
The IFAD from Paulo was, what would you do if you were at IFAD? What's the future? How would IFAD sort of position itself there?
Well, I will be very happy. This is a very nice place, no doubt.
Okay, other than the venue and Rome as a location.
No, really, I think that from what I've seen, it has very good possibilities to really make the transformation into, because you have the specialization in agriculture and rural areas. That, as I said in another meeting here a couple of days ago, in the other MBAs, you have also, they look at agricultural and poverty issues, but that's a portion in a big program. It's not that, in this case, you have the priority. But if you focus on that and you add up products that will be, for expertise, for the preparation of good programs and good projects, to get involved in things, then you can play the catalytic role, because others will be willing, because you have the expertise. I see this a very, very interesting institution. And what I have seen is that the leadership right now has the intention, the willingness to look at the future with new eyes, which is a very good thing. So those who have the political power, most likely, are the ones who have to say, yes, let's move in the reforms, let's do this, let's be creative. Or they say no. I hope they say yes, because the chance is there.
Cheryl?
I don't have too much to add. I'm curious to hear Joachim. I think it's very hard to change. I'm sure it's not possible with really inspired leadership. I think it's very hard. There's so many internal incentives that are working against change. But I mean, I can't say it's not possible, but you really have to have very strong, dedicated, good leadership to do it. And I don't think we've seen it too often, although maybe some of you in the audience can think of examples.
Okay, thank you. Joachim, can institutions transform? Do we always need a new one? Was one of the questions. Jan Willem's question, shareholders play a role in the ambition of the institution. How do you work with them to limit that? And then, of course, if you have any suggestions for IFAD in its future.
I think if you allow me, I'll pass on the third one for the benefit of time. But on the first two, how to reform institutions? I mean, first, yes, sometimes you need to create a new institution. Sometimes you need creative disruption of a system. And I think the creation of a new institution is just that. And it has followed long periods of frustration with lack of ability to reform systems. So sometimes it's necessary. Why is it so hard to reform the existing institutions? Let me suggest two types of answers, or two buckets. One is related to the internal organization of, and I'm talking mostly about probably the most complex of the development institutions that I've had the privilege of working for a long time, where a lot of resource and power are vested very deeply in the institution, where so much control lies so far distributed. And it is therefore very difficult to change, even with the very best intention from the top. It's an academic institution where everybody knows, everybody thinks they know best how to work in their particular area, and they're right, because the mandate of the institution is so broad that the technical staff do indeed know better how to deal with their particular area than the boss does. But it translates into an academic institution that has huge inertia built in. So I think one direction would be to build a much more managerial culture. I'll come back to that when I talk about my organization, but where actually you can drive change from the top, which I think in an established, very broadly set up institution is almost impossible. The second bucket I would relate to shareholder issues or shareholder role. I think the MDBs, by and large, suffer from benign neglect by their shareholders. And for big changes, you need leadership. Like Enrique says, you need ministers and heads of government to come in to drive big changes, especially when you have a wide and diverse shareholdership, 190 countries that need to align around a set of changes. You need very strong leadership. And that requires escalation in government. It requires a level of engagement at the top that is very unusual to generate for the MDBs, which are suffering from that kind of neglect. And yet some changes are possible. I've been involved recently in some of the, I think, pretty important financial innovations in the World Bank. And similar innovations have happened at the ADB. Both institutions have financially leveraged their concessional finance arms. So that has happened. It's an example of very significant innovation in ADB and World Bank. But I can also tell you how much work that is, this modest change, and how much work over many years it is to align shareholders to a change of that nature. Luckily it succeeded, but it's hard work. So then turning to AIB as the new institution where we don't yet have the challenge of having to change, but the challenge of building a new institution that is more adaptable. I think this whole concept of leanness and financial strength and managerial culture comes together to the kind of institution we want to build. Lean in terms of staffing, not always following the instinct that if there is a demand, you need to hire people, but first asking who else in the world has that capacity and can we actually work together with them despite the challenge of working across institutions. Financial strength, absolutely essential. Because if your financial model relies on continuous shareholder contributions, you have a continuous channel for building up an ambitious agenda, a well-intentioned but ambitious agenda. And to avoid that, I think it is unavoidable to build an internally financially strong model that does not rely on the continuous shareholder financial contributions. And then I think the focus also allows you to build a more managerial culture. Compare World Bank and IMF in terms of the culture. In this case, an institution like the IMF, which has a much narrower professional focus, also has a more managerial culture that you can actually drive change through, because it happens so that the boss is in a sense the better macroeconomist than the junior person, and you naturally have a more hierarchical system. Not to say that hierarchy is always good, but it does allow change to happen. And so in that sense, I think that's the kind of organization we're building, a bit more managerial, more focused and financially strong.
Can I add one thing which I think is very important in the process of change? For leadership in the institution, not only to have the contact, the normal contact with the ministers, you have to reach the heads of government. That's a very, very important thing. To have the heads of government on the boat, that they understand, not through intermediaries, direct dialogue. That requires political skill.
Absolutely.
So lots and lots of very good questions, good feedback. I will take now the liberty of not being the chair, but answering actually also Paulo's question on the basis of my time at IFAD, which is dated. It's a bit older. But I do think that IFAD will have a particular challenge to deal with because rural development, rural poverty is a perpetual problem. It's been around forever. And if anything, climate change, inequality, the erosion of natural resources will make that problem even worse. Yes, there is a large rural-urban migration, a lot of more people move into urban centers, but also that has its limits, and we can't sort of think of a world where nobody will live in rural areas. One thing which I think is a strength and a potential weakness of IFAD is that it's a small institution. Small means that it doesn't come with the firepower of, say, one of the big regional banks or the World Bank Group, but it means that it needs to be an innovator and a catalyst, and that is very much in line with its mandate. At the time when I was here, and this might have changed, a lot of the focus was on emulating the World Bank and trying to do loans just like the World Bank. I think IFAD would be much stronger if it would build innovation into its projects, innovation as in trying different answers to development challenges, inbuilt evaluation, whether it's impact or otherwise, and making continuous course corrections. And being a small institution, it could actually do that, and do that in collaboration and exchange across different countries and different regions. And I think that would be making this institution even more powerful. But let's stop here. We still have one more agenda item in terms of the closing of the session. But please join me to thank the panelists for an excellent discussion. Many, many thanks to all of you.
So thank you again to our chair and our distinguished guests, and thank you to all of you for being so actively involved in the discussions. I would now like to invite Mr. Masoud Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development, to present some of his reflections for the future.
Well, thank you very much, and Thank you, Oscar, for inviting me. Thank you all for staying through to the end of the afternoon. I'm conscious of the fact that you've all been here a bit of time, and we've just had a very rich discussion. And really, at this stage, what's the most useful thing that I can do for an extra 10 or 15 minutes? And I thought what I might do is just reflecting from that conversation, and also on the work that's been done by my colleagues at the Center for Global Development, which led to that report that Caroline referred to at the beginning. Say a couple of sets of things which strike me as being relevant for us to think through as we go forward. And I want to preface that by saying that for us, we all work in the system in one way or the other, and I think we're conscious that perhaps the outside world isn't quite as supportive and enthusiastic of our work as it used to be. For those of us who've been in the system a long time, as it used to be a long time ago or even a few years ago. But I think it's worth remembering that this is quite a different environment in which our work is being done. It's different both in terms of the support for or appreciation of the benefits of a multilateral approach to solving problems. You see that now in many spheres, in the political, in the military, in the development also. More and more people are questioning whether it's actually better to go their own way, and I think that's something we need to think through. And it's also a different world in terms of understanding and appreciating the value of supporting development and understanding what development is all about. So I think now, if you go and talk to people and say, what do they understand by economic development? What do they understand by what should be the focus of international institutions that support economic development? I think you'll get a wide range of answers. And just to caricature, in my mind, there is sort of one view of it, which is essentially about how you can help the people who don't have access to the very basic human services, how you can extend that provision of those services to people in parts of the world where their own governments can't provide them. And so your focus is very much on service delivery of the very poorest. And then there's another sort of caricature, which is essentially that it's really about how you encourage the economic and social development of countries and societies, which in a sustainable way enables them to take care of not only their basic needs, but of the needs as you move up the economic and social ladder. And then you get into a much broader definition of what you're doing, and the country becomes a sort of a principal interaction for you. That's the sort of basic model around which the MDBs were set up. But if you look today, many of the newer institutions that have been set up in the last decade or so actually are not based on the country-based model. They really come in with a view of saying our objective is to ensure that every child gets access to education, or everybody gets immunization. And in a way, the country is there and the government is there, and sometimes it's a partner and sometimes it's a hindrance. But our really focus is not so much on how you build up systems in countries, but rather on how you do that. And I think there's a big debate going on out there, and we need to be conscious of that too. Now, in all that, let's come back to the MDBs and what sort of challenges they face. And you've seen in the report, there are some areas we've identified, whether it's the billions to trillions agenda, infrastructure, whether it's global public goods, whether it's the work on looking at conflicts, refugees, humanitarian linkages, disaster relief, or whether it's the issue of concessional financing. And I won't go over each of them, but I want to use them to illustrate what I think is going to be the challenge. So let me take the issue of how MDBs can support the leveraging of private finance to go from billions to trillions. if you do today, go look around in all of the MDBs, they all have a statement now that in varying degrees says that the main focus of their work is going to be to help leverage private financing for infrastructure. And yet when you look at the numbers, you don't quite see that. So maybe it's a question of time, but I think it's more than time. I think it's partly a question of instruments, which is they don't really have, but partly it's a question of the risk aversion of both staff, management, and their boards, because often the boards are actually quite risk averse in this. But most of all, in my mind, it's a question of the incentive structure and the behavioral cultural change that will be required, so that if you're working in an MDB and you work on infrastructure, you're not focused on the project you're doing, but on the projects you can help somebody else do, and that you're rewarded for it. And today, the fact of the matter is that although we say all this, the World Bank has the cascade model, others have different versions of this, at the end of the day, very quickly we lapse back into the language where it is what we have done that becomes the focus of recognition and reward rather than what we have enabled somebody else to do. And so smart people in that system respond to those incentives, and it becomes harder for us to change. So that's really a cultural change that you have to bring about. And it's also partly, we organized recently at the spring meetings a roundtable bringing together private equity, financial sector people, people from developing countries, and also IFI leaders to discuss what are the practical obstacles of going from billions to trillions. And after everybody had gone through explaining what a great job everyone was doing, and we started having a real conversation, it actually got down very quickly to some very real practical problems and cultural problems that have to be resolved. So I use that as an illustration of that. Secondly, the question of dealing with refugees. So now we have everybody in the development ministries and the foreign ministries of the rich countries, particularly in Europe, is super focused on the need to ensure that we can find ways to deal with protracted refugees, because these displaced people are going to be there for a long time. Their needs are more than immediate humanitarian needs. Their needs are also for education, livelihoods, etc. And MDBs have some skill set in there. They also have money. Humanitarian system doesn't have the money, and the money that we provide for it, we provide in a very ad hoc, inefficient way, and they don't have the skills to be able to provide long-term engagement. So you try to bring the MDBs into that world. Under pressure from shareholders and through innovation, they see a need, they all try to come into it in varying degrees. And now, I'm a little bit worried about what this means in terms of how you do that business where you bring your skills, but you don't overrun and overwhelm the humanitarian and relief agencies, who actually also have some very important skills to work with this population, but who are on a weaker footing now because they don't bring as much finance to the table. So it's a cultural issue of how you work with those different institutions, and I think that will be a very big challenge for the IFIs. And the final one I want to mention is the whole area of global public goods and the role of MDBs in the delivery of global public goods. Of course, in some ways, MDBs have been involved in global public goods of one sort or the other for a long, long time. The World Bank has been supporting CGIAR for a very long time. Climate and environmental related financing has been done in the World Bank and other institutions for 20 years. But all of this work has been done on the side of your regular business. And I think we still have not come to a clear view as to how and to what extent this should be part of the main focus of these institutions, and draw some lines around it, because otherwise there's a real danger that you do things where you have a combination of some willingness on the part of donors or shareholders to support it and entrepreneurial ability among staff and management to exploit it. You come together, you create a new institution or new arrangement, new trust fund, and suddenly, before you know it, you are overrun with the number of trust funds that are all targeted at doing different things and which make the governance of that organization impossible to do. So basically, I used to say that when I was in DFID for 3 years, and one of my responsibilities in DFID in the UK was to manage, oversee the sort of multilateral spending that we did, so it included oversight of the World Bank, that I had more influence in shaping the World Bank's policy agenda by being in DFID, because I had so many trust funds I managed, than I did by being a vice president inside the World Bank. And I think it brought home to me the problem that this different governance model has created for actually focusing this. So I want to say that all of these areas will raise difficult challenges for us going forward at a time when we have to actually deal with them quickly. Now, let me just say a couple of things about one other set of points which I want to mention, which a lot of has come up today around governance. Because a lot of these issues don't sit with the staff and the management. They really are an issue of how these institutions are governed. And I do think that the fundamental difference between the legacy institutions, particularly the World Bank Group, and because it's very large, is the fact that the governance has been one of, I think, one can use the term benign neglect, and I very much agree with that. So nobody's kind of opposed to it, but nobody's willing to put in the energy at the right level and the political capital to actually bring about major change. So it's fine if you can allow staff and management to then kind of drive the process, as long as they don't go into some red lines. They pretty much do what they want, if they can find somebody who's willing to help them finance that. And the way that these institutions have responded to new challenges, this is to come back to the point of whether or not you can actually transform or not. They have transformed. The World Bank of today is a very different institution from the World Bank that I joined, in 1979. If you compare the two, they would look very different. But the way they have transformed is through growth. So you add on and you add on. And so you never actually give up anything. You just keep growing and adding on new tasks. And that works as long as you have unlimited ability to add on. And if you believe that management span can cover everything, then it's not a bad model. It may be the only model. But going forward, we won't have the financing and the ability to keep transforming through adding on. We have to change through giving up some things to do something else. And that requires much harder political decisions. So I would say for governance, the first issue that the boards have to, and not just the boards, but I would say the shareholders have to do, is to figure out what is the extent of each of these institutions. I personally do believe that the commingling of the concessional lending function and the non-concessional development banking function has actually resulted in a progressive accretion of concerns that were coming from the donors of the concessional money onto the main agenda of the development banks, which has actually made the development banks very heavy. So if you think about the governance structure of the World Bank Group, for example, you have a board, and then you have the IDA deputies. And the IDA deputies are generally considerably higher level than the board is in many ways. At least, well, I think in my experience, they were the people who had more clout. And they use the IDA allocations as a way of shaping the policy agenda for IDA, and then periodically it crept over into the policy agenda for IBRD. And maybe, I mean, I'm not disputing whether those are good things or bad things, but the people who borrowed from IBRD never felt that they had an opportunity to really engage in that policy debate in the same way. So I think that's another governance issue. Another point on governance is that I think now we have to recognize that we are moving to a multipolar governance structure for the MDBs. So instead of worrying about what does AIIB and the BRICS Bank mean for the governance model, you know, in terms of how we can integrate them, I think we have to recognize that we can't integrate them into the Washington-centered governance model, which already the regional development banks, by and large, have in varying degrees been uncomfortable with, because they didn't feel that they were getting the same space to articulate their concerns in that framework. And now I think we have to think about a network in which we try and figure out together how we're going to learn from the different experiences and see it as a two-way thing. You know, it's not just about how do the new institutions adapt to the old system. It is how does the old system recognize the gains that have come from new institutions that have come about in a different environment, and how do we work to bring that on board? So that two-way street, I think, is still something that is relatively new to us. And similarly, I would say the financing model issue that has been raised. I think that the financing model of some of the old institutions is not sustainable with the size of the lending they do, the spreads that they can command, the low interest rate environment, which means that their equity doesn't give them the income on which to run their business. That's really how they used to be financed. I mean, they were essentially financed by having a pot of money which earned a substantial income every year and which financed the operations cost. Now that low interest environment, you can't do that. And yet adding staff costs one on top of the other by asking them to do all kinds of public goods. So I think we have to step back and say, what is the financing model that we want for them? And in that context, I think we do need to look at how they relate one to the other. So it may not be specialization, maybe that's not the right answer, but we can't have a model in which people are burdened down more and more by a high-cost delivery system, and they're not able to make choices from it. So let me end by saying perhaps one thing, which is that I do think that it is one of the roles of the MDBs, IFIs, to initiate and manage a conversation, manage is not the right term, initiate and support a conversation around how to deal with issues on development in the broad. So we're talking about RCTs, you know, these random control trials. I'm not a great fan of RCTs personally, because I think that they have generated a huge amount of an industry of work answering interesting questions about small things while diverting attention away from asking difficult questions about bigger things to which there are no simple answers. I think almost 80 or 90% of PhDs in economics today are being done around an RCT. It's a simple, low-risk way to get a PhD. If you want to get a PhD, identify a simple problem on which you can set up a control trial, run a control trial, write it up, and you basically get your PhD. If you want to do a PhD thinking about what is the nature of development, I mean, it's a little bit harder, a bit uncertain. So in a risk-averse world, that's what kids do. So I would really think we need to start the broader conversation about some of these questions around development and how to manage the risks that countries are going to face and the world is going to face as we move forward. And that's a task which the MDBs are really well placed to lead and to support, but which I think I find that at the moment I don't see that happening in the way that it should. So I offer you this as a sort of concluding set of thoughts, but really just drawing upon the comments that were already made by the excellent panel that came before. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. I'd like to invite Oscar for some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks to all of you for remaining with us until this late hour. It has been a fascinating afternoon, and indeed I think we have achieved our objective as ECG in propitiating an important dialogue. And I want to emphasize the word dialogue in a Platonic sense, because we did have questions without easy answers. Right? But I think that it was important to pose those questions, and for that I want to thank profusely our distinguished panelists, which, as you have seen, have come with a wealth of experience, but also with a variety of experiences and perspectives. We went out of the box, really inviting not only the traditional MDBs who are members of the ECG, but also some non-ECG members, and we were really privileged to have the experiences of CAF that presented an alternative model to important issues such as governance and so forth, but also the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that helped us rethink about our traditional approaches to the relationship, not only with our member states, which were so greatly represented by the Minister of Planning of Indonesia, with very clear set of priorities to ourselves in terms of the development challenges faced by our countries, but also in terms of rethinking the relationship between our institutions and independent evaluation. And as such, I think we really benefited. I don't want to summarize what we have heard this afternoon. I just want to thank you all and wish you a very good day. Thank you.